Hi there, hope you're having a pleasant day wherever you may be. I find myself on another adventure here. This one's going to be of a different road variety. It's going to be the railroad. I'm going to be taking the Coast Starlight, one of the Amtrak long distance trains, up from Los Angeles to Seattle. And I hopefully will document some of the cool things you can see along the way, as well as kind of give you a little glimpse into what it's like to ride on the train. Well, I ride the train more often than the average person, I think, and a lot of times they have questions or they're just kind of curious, so hopefully this will answer some of those. Also, there's a video going around online that kind of talks about the Coast Starlight route, but not in the most accurate light, so hopefully this will give a little more realistic perspective of what this trip is like. So with that said, let's hit the road. Before we begin, here's a quick look at the 1,300-mile journey that we're about to take from Los Angeles to Seattle, a trip that takes about 34 hours. Now, our journey begins here at LA Union Station in downtown LA. It was built in 1939 and it's often considered the last of the great stations because it was the last sort of grand station built before sort of the decline of the railroad. But it's a gorgeous building, a lot of Art Deco influences, a lot of Spanish influences, and it's got nice little courtyards that are kind of relaxing if you don't want to sit in the waiting room. The waiting room itself has a lot of charm. The chairs are really cool. They've been there for decades. It's also really well known because they use it for filming a lot. With its proximity to Hollywood, it gets used a lot in commercials, movies, TV shows, all sorts of things. If you just kind of pay attention, you can spot a lot of the signature aspects of the station if you're just kind of paying attention. Union Station also features what's known as the Amtrak Metropolitan Lounge. There's a handful of stations across the country that feature this first-class lounge, which is available to sleeping car passengers on the Coast Starlight, Southwest Chief, Sunset Limited, or business class passengers on the Pacific Surfliner, or also the Coast Starlight. It's a nice little quiet area. They offer coffee, juices, pastries, drinks like that, and it's just a nice little place to hang out before you catch your train, instead of sort of the hustle and bustle of the main waiting room, which is gorgeous. It's well worth to hang out in that one as well, but it's a little quieter, a little more relaxing, I guess you could say. All in all, Union Station is a pretty great place to start your rail journey from Los Angeles. As departure time approaches, it's time to soak up those last few moments in Union Station and start to head on down to the platform to board the train. And now we wait on the platform for 10:10, our departure time, before we hit the rails. And indeed, at 10 past 10 in the morning, our train began to slowly pull out of the station, offering us a couple of last glimpses of some LA landmarks, including City Hall and Dodger Stadium. The journey north is officially underway. The early scenery could probably best be described as industrial as we leave downtown behind and head to the valley. As we depart Los Angeles, you spend the first few minutes getting used to your accommodations. In this case, I'm in the Superliner roomette in the sleeping car on the train. I will admit that the sleeping car prices can be a little steep. However, you are getting to sleep in a bed at night. You do get your meals in the dining car provided, which is a nice perk. Roomette is the most affordable, however it is the smallest. The larger bedroom is much more spacious, but you're going to pay for it. So here I am in the Superliner roomette in the daytime configuration. I will admit that when you first step into the room, it does feel a little cramped, especially with another person, but I guarantee you after a little while you do realize you do have enough room to be comfortable. Some of the features are, obviously you get your own window, which is washed out at the moment. You get a table. You do have your own electrical outlet. There's only one though, so if there's two people in the room, hopefully you can share. Hopefully it's someone you get along with. Private reading lights. The bunk is pushed up out of the way, so it gives you a little bit of headroom. There's enough room to store couple of smaller bags. If you have any larger bags, there's a rack in the middle of the car that you can keep that luggage there. So yeah, Superliner roulette in the daytime configuration. Our train races across the San Fernando Valley, including stops at Burbank Airport and Van Nuys, before reaching the Santa Susana Pass just outside of Chatsworth. This rocky region is a part of a small mountain range that was once a location for shooting Western movies. After passing through a few tunnels, we have a stop at Simi Valley before cruising through the farmlands near Oxnard. It isn't long before we reach the coast near Ventura. It's along this stretch that we begin getting our first great views of the coastline as we play trade-off with the 101 for who gets the closer view of the water's edge. But it's also here that we get a sobering glimpse of the devastation left by the recent Thomas fire that decimated the region just a month prior. The scorched landscape is juxtaposed by the beautiful coastline. Not long after, we find ourselves in picturesque Santa Barbara. It's here that we get our first of many fresh air stops on the trip, and you can briefly step off the train to stretch your legs or have a smoke, or look at the nearby Morton Bay fig tree, the largest in the United States. It's about 3 hours to our next stop, and what could arguably be considered the highlight of the trip. We begin to hug the coast again, often paralleling the 101. We even pass an historic road bridge from the old route. The views are pretty great, but not entirely unique up to this point. It's not until we reach the pier at Gaviota State Park where the 101 cuts inland and we part ways along a stretch of coastline that is mostly seen by those riding the train. Now that is mostly due to the fact that there are few roads and mostly private land in this region, so much of this rugged stretch of coastline is exclusive to the Coast Starlight, or to any hobos that might have hopped onto a freight train. The hardest part about this stretch is trying not to get too much glare in your photographs. Now, you also get a chance to see Point Conception, that sort of western corner of California that juts out into the Pacific and serves as sort of a geographic dividing line between southern and central California. But it also means that we begin to head in a more northerly direction from now on. While very remote, there are a couple of public beaches, but overall, another reason for the limited access to the area is because we are traveling through Vandenberg Air Force Base. Most recently, it's known from its numerous rocket launches, but it was also once slated to be a western launch point for the space shuttle. But shortly after the Challenger accident, the idea was scrapped. Still, some of the buildings are visible, as well as many others, including current projects like SpaceX. The Pacific Parlour Car is a first-class lounge exclusive to the Coast Starlight. It's a dedicated car that offers comfy seats, nice panoramic windows, and little things like they do an afternoon wine tasting. It's also an alternative place to have lunch or dinner. It's a really unique experience. It's a really nice looking car. There's really nothing else like it on the Amtrak system, unfortunately. They're old cars, cost a lot to maintain, and after about 20 years of service as the Parlour Car and about 70 years of existence, they are now finally being retired. We continue briefly along the coast before heading inland to our next stop, San Luis Obispo. Our next stop is San Luis Obispo, another fresh air stop where you can step off the train and stretch your legs for a couple minutes before heading out and immediately having to tackle the quest to grade. This section is a personal favorite due to the many curves, including the famous horseshoe curve, where you can see both the front and the back of the train at the same time. Along with getting many views of the train, I also enjoy the many rolling hills. It's also here that we get to see two very different approaches to overcoming the quest to pass. Off to the east is the 101, taking a much steeper approach than the rails on the west side. It's around this point that if you're taking this trip during the winter months, you'll probably start to lose your daylight around Paso Robles. During the summertime and on the southbound journey, you get to pass this during the daylight hours, and you'll get to see things like the Salinas River Valley and then the farmlands just outside of Salinas known as the nation's salad bowl. The station stop of Salinas is also a fresh air break where you could step off for a few minutes before heading past the wetlands of Elkhorn Slough, where you'll probably see a lot of cranes and animals like that. And then you'll pass some rolling hills just south of Gilroy, where you allegedly pass the over the San Andreas Fault. Although it's really hidden in the landscape, it's really hard to distinguish. Next three Bay Area stops of San Jose, Oakland, and Emeryville all have various transfer options to San Francisco, though Emeryville offers the Amtrak Thruway bus. From there, you skirt along the eastern side of the San Francisco Bay until you hit Martinez and then cross a long bridge across the finger of the bay before heading inland to the cities of Davis and Sacramento. With arrival into Sacramento around midnight, it's your last chance of the evening to stretch your legs before calling it a night if you haven't already. So here is the roomette in the nighttime configuration, or I guess more appropriately right now, the early morning configuration. The two lower seats in the daytime push together to form the lower bunk. The upper bunk just folds down, and that's actually where the mattress for the lower bunk is kept. So there's a mattress up here, mattress down here. It's kind of a low ceiling. But it is pretty comfortable. It's much nicer than sleeping in a coach seat, which I've done several times. And one thing I will comment though is that once it is in the bed configuration, space is kind of at a premium. There's not a lot of room to maneuver, so you just gotta be creative and things like that. So, but overall, not a bad way to spend the night on the train. Overnight and into the early morning, you pass through Chico, Redding, and Dunsmuir, which is a shame because the region around Dunsmuir is actually quite beautiful. This is one region where you might not mind your train being about an hour late or so, because it means that you might get a chance to see beautiful Mount Shasta. Unfortunately, our train had the lateness, but the clouds had something else in mind, keeping the mountain shrouded in mystery. Not seeing Shasta doesn't take away from the fact that waking up to the Northern California landscape is not a bad way to start off a day as you race toward the Oregon border. As you approach the state line, the tracks will parallel a road that goes through the small town of Doris, California. And then, with very little fanfare, you pass through a couple of tunnels and you find yourself in the state of Oregon. When it comes to mealtime on the train, you have a couple of options, and one of those options is eating in the dining car. The dining car offers sit down meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, depending on whether or not the schedule allows for it. And it's one of the last places that still employs community seating. Yes, that means if you're in a party of less than four, there's a good chance you're going to make a new friend or two because they try to fill up those tables to maximize the space and the time allotted. It's a great way to meet your fellow travelers. You meet a lot of interesting people that way. As for the food, I will say it's pretty decent to good. And I'm kind of grading that on a curve because they do have limited resources both financially and just physically on the train. However, I will admit that the prices are kind of steep. And like I said before, your meals in the dining car are included if you have a sleeping car. So That makes it affordable when I travel on the train. If I were traveling in coach, uh, it is a little steep for my budget. That's the whole reason why I am in coach. So if anything, I'll do maybe one meal just for the experience, or I'll just find other food options as the trip goes if I'm in coach. But all in all, meal in the dining car is kind of one of those classic rail experiences. After almost 24 hours since our journey began, we finally cross over into our second state as we cruise through southern Oregon, seen here blanketed in snow, on our way to our first stop of the morning, Klamath Falls. I'm here in Klamath Falls, the first fresh air stop of the morning in Oregon. It's a little chilly today. Looks like there's some fresh snow. It's actually snowing right now, even though it's blue skies. A little bit of snow falling. Um, but it's chilly, but nice place to stretch your legs, and even get some nice views of the train, actually. Now, as far as I know, there aren't any falls nearby. However, there is a Klamath Lake, which we travel along just outside of town for several miles as we continue north toward the mountains. Now, I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't at least discuss riding in coach. Coach is like flying in an airline, with the exception that the chairs are a little wider. You do get significantly more leg room, and they recline further back. Um, and traveling during the day, it's perfectly comfortable. It's perfectly fine. However, going long distances, going overnight, you are sleeping in a chair, so it is a little uncomfortable at times. If you can deal with it, that's great. I've done it several times myself, but it is a challenge. Also, you're in a car with like 60 people. By the end of a long journey, sometimes the bathrooms on the lower level, they do get a little grungy, so um, that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, on the Coast Starlight, you do have business class, which for all intents and purposes is essentially coach. The chairs are essentially the same, um, except you are considered first class, which means you get access to Amtrak's Metropolitan Lounge, and you do get a couple vouchers, $6 each, to be used in the lounge car or dining car, and you do get a couple bottles of water. So those are nice little perks. Plus, those cars tend to not be as crowded, so they're a little quieter, a little more comfortable. But yes, if you are going to be traveling just during the length of the day, coach is perfectly fine. However, if you're going to be overnight, I suggest probably springing for the room. It does make it a little more comfortable. We continue heading up through Oregon, passing through normally lush green landscapes and forests, blanketed in snow on this winter ride, before eventually reaching the small town of Chemult. This is the closest stop to Crater Lake before we chug along towards the Willamette Pass. This is where the Coast Starlight crosses over the Cascade Mountain Range that extends from Washington down to Northern California. This stretch of the trip is often considered one of the most scenic, rivaling the very different beauty of the California coastline. The train slowly snakes its way down the mountain pass, offering several views of the train as we go along, and passing through more than 20 tunnels. On the northbound journey, it is all but guaranteed that you will pass through this region during the daylight hours. However, heading southbound, this section is passed during dusk and the early evening during the summer months and in the dark in the wintertime, which is quite a shame. Once we reach the bottom of the pass, we go through a small town of Oak Ridge, and if you carefully look, maybe you can spot the red covered bridge just outside of town. As we pass several lumber yards, we eventually end up in the town of Eugene, our next fresh air stop, and so we can step off the train and stretch our legs. Now, a great place to spend some time during your rail journey is in the Sightseer Lounge Car, or also known just as the Lounge Car, or also known as the Cafe Car. This is the one with the big picture windows that go all the way up to the ceiling, and it's usually found toward the middle of the train. It's open to all passengers. It offers a couple different types of seating, usually tables, as well as seats that sort of face out. It's a really great place to spend some time. When the train's not very crowded, I usually spend all day in there. On a more crowded train, as a courtesy, I'll go back to my sleeper or my seat, just as a courtesy to other people that also might want to use the car. Now, on the lower level, that's where you can find the cafe that you can buy food and drink and assuming you're not eating in the dining car or brought your own. Now, to be honest, the offerings are a little bit limited, and things that are heated are dead so in a microwave. And the pricing's a little steep too, so like a candy bar is like $2.75, just for perspective. Overall, the lounge car is a place that I really enjoy when I'm on the train. After leaving Eugene, our train sprints through the agricultural region of the Willamette Valley, and we loosely follow the Willamette River. We have brief stops in Albany and Salem before passing through Oregon City and getting a good view of the Willamette Falls, as well as seeing the end of the Oregon Trail, as noted by the white arches meant to look like a covered wagon. From there, it's not long before we reach Portland, Oregon. We cross the steel bridge over the Willamette River before arriving into Portland Union Station. This is another beautiful station that happens to have a very persuasive sign atop of it. It's also a station that features one of Amtrak's Metropolitan lounges. And it is also our last fresh air stop of the trip, so make sure to step off, stretch your legs, and hop back on board for the rest of the journey. Shortly after leaving Portland, we have 3 water crossings, the last 2 being crossing the mighty Columbia River as we finally make our way into our third and final state of the trip, Washington. Immediately after crossing the river, we have a stop in Vancouver, Washington, and from there we continue along the Columbia River for several miles into our new state. It's also around this time that during the winter months we start to lose our daylight and our scenery becomes our reflection again. As part of our final sprint to the finish, we have brief stops in Kelso Longview, Centralia, and Olympia Lacey. It is during this stretch that, unfortunately, due to the devastating consequences of the Amtrak Cascades derailment in December 2017, the Coast Starlight continues on its old route along the banks of the Puget Sound. It is on this stretch that we get to see the second and third versions of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, the first having gained the nickname of Galloping Gertie due to its poor design, which caused it to shake violently in the wind, ultimately leading to its collapse into the water back in the 1940s. There's a brief stop in Tacoma before our final push into the Emerald City. Before we get in, we pass both the baseball and football stadiums as we slowly glide into the last station of our journey. On this particular trip, we were upwards of an hour late on the second day of our journey, but over the course of the day we managed to make up most of it and have arrived into Seattle mostly on time, thus concluding this 1,300-mile and 34-hour journey that started from Los Angeles the day before. At last, we've arrived. King Street Station, Seattle, Washington. Here's a little better glimpse of where you end up. Seattle's King Street Station, this time in the daylight. Built in 1906, the station features a replica of the San Marcos Tower in Venice, Italy. In 2013, the interior was beautifully restored after decades of neglect. Seattle's obviously home to some pretty cool things like the Space Needle, Pike Place Market with the flying fish, and many, many other things to see. It's a really cool town. It's worth taking a trip for. Well, that does it for this one. I hope you had a good time following along and looking at some of the different aspects of riding the train, like looking at the sleeper car, the now defunct parlor car, the dining car, as well as some of the scenery you get to see on the route to Seattle. So I hope you had a good time following along, as much as I had actually taken the trip, and hopefully it inspires you to do a little train trip of your own. And I guess that'll do it for this one, and I'll see you on the next adventure.